Leka Klenach, Meda DeWitt, Yuchat Duasak, Spinget Klenach, Zetzinak, Yuchat Duasak, Nanyaina Chatzati, Tachadi Yeti Chatzati, Shtakin Kwan Echat. My English name is Meda DeWitt. My Tlingit name is, my birth Tlingit name is Zetzinak, but my bossy auntie name is Jamutla, or Mother of the Mountain Goats. And my family comes from Wrangell and Yakutat, but I live on Denina Ethnena in Anchorage, Alaska with my family. My sweetheart and I, we have 8 kids total, 5 still at home, 3 adulting. And we can get in a little bit more about why running for governor, but I also want to invite my team to go ahead and introduce themselves. I'll hand it over to Chris Steer.
Hi everyone. Thanks for having us. Yeah, I was born in Fairbanks. My Alaskan family is from Unalakleet. My Inupiaq relatives are from Unalakleet and Koyuk. I also have not quite as many kids. I've got 5 kids at home. Well, 5 kids altogether, but they are all still at home. Um, yeah, and so, I started my career in education, tutoring kids. I did 12 years in the military, 6 years Navy, 6 years Air Force. And when I got out, I went back to tutoring, which I really enjoy. But yeah, this is, Alaska's very important to me, always has been. It's always home. I've been a lot of places with the Navy and outside of the Navy. And yeah, we really want to see this be a place where our families can continue to thrive um, for the thousands of years to come.
The reason why I'm running for office is because I'm a lifelong Alaskan. My family has been dedicated to service to Alaskans for many generations. And we I was raised with this concept of responsibility for community and for land, and I take that very seriously. I'm also was trained as a traditional healer in my youth and have been trained in systems thinking and addressing complex issues. And that's a way of applying it to either a human body as a practitioner, as a traditional healer, and diagnosing or working with people with their illnesses, or in ecosystem failures and understanding how to address systemic disruptions. And I've worked in public health and also in law and policy, as well as in conservation and community organizing and advocacy. So we're here today to answer your questions. There was 13 of them, and I'll just recap for the community. We have one question that is, what are IRMA mining standards? That's a fun one because I really like IRMA. Uh, any large infrastructure projects you support and what benefits for Alaskans? Also, where do you stand on Ambler Road and Alaska LNG pipeline? We also received Ada seems a waste of millions of dollars in projects that never happen. What's your plan? Um, I can say that in my experience, everybody hates Ada. Um, let's see here. Title 8 has not been followed for decades. How do you push back on industries to protect subsistence? Animal numbers are down here, and Fish and Game does not listen. Can that be reformed? Federal rules give rural residents priority. Can state law realistically prioritize locals? How will you fund education and public services? Mostly by taxing oil companies or more? Question mark. Nuksit trilateral was a great idea. Can the state push back and reinstate that idea? Where would renewable energy funding come from, state or federal? How would the Guardian program work here with no tribal governments? How many jobs per community? How would you manage state resources to help salmon in their habitat? And most of us work in tourism. How will you work with that sector and groups like ATIA? And that was the last question. So I guess what I'd like to do is go to the group and ask which ones would you like to prioritize or hear about first, and we'll just work through them as we go.
Um, I'd be fine with just hearing kind of the wildlife related questions. Um, yeah, about like fish and game and um, kind of yeah, you can reform that, or even if you have like anybody in mind, like cabinet wise, that you're kind of leaning towards. Like, yeah, your
That's a funny one because when we were in on Alaska and we were talking, I was talking about the Fish and Game Commission and how we need to bifurcate those positions, one for fish and one for game, largely because fish politics takes over all of their time, and then our game gets largely ignored and mismanaged. And I suggested, I was like, we need somebody like Brad Harris. To be our commissioner of fish. And I got a call today and he's like, "Hey, I heard from a colleague that you're going to appoint me as commissioner to fish." I said, "Well, I used you as a reference." But he's excited, so we're going to have further conversations. But the people that exemplify commissioner positions are people who have show excellence in their career, people who understand science and data and who work on the topics already, who also understand the intricacies of the issues. We've seen a lot of time in the past, especially the last 8 years, where it's basically nepotism or, people's best bros get appointed to substantial positions. Um, I do not want to do that. I would like the state to be run by people who are actively understanding that topic, working on the topic, and have solutions for that topic, and who are willing to listen to the people. We've seen, a lot of adversarial activities against community members, against tribes, against anything that isn't aligned with, making big money for millionaires or billionaires out of the state. For us, we're going to shift to focusing on Alaskans. If any of you may remember, I ran the Recall Dunleavy campaign several years ago. I was the statewide organizer and the chair for that campaign. And that really came about as a request from the people because the budget was cutting things like education and healthcare and elder benefits and so many more things that we care about and make it so that we can actually live here. Because Alaska, we have a restricted economy that has been based on oil and gas and hasn't served us. So let's see here. Wildlife. Let me go through your questions and find the wildlife question. Title 8 has not been followed for decades. How would you push back on industry to protect subsistence? This is great. So Title 8 has been honored on paper, but largely ignored in practice. And really what Title 8 in our Constitution refers to is that we have the management for sustained yield of our fish and wildlife in our environment. So the root of the problem is since McDowell in 1989, our state constitution has been read to bar a rural subsistence priority. And again, that's that adversarial to community members and people. And it threw us out of compliance with Title 8 because Title 8 is actually supposed to make us highlight the Alaskan way of life and sufficiently manage, rural and urban needs along with the environment needs for regeneration and renewal of the stock. So that ruling actually split the state and federal systems and frustrated everybody in the process. So what we're looking at is we need to work with the legislature to have a 2/3 majority. So that way we can have an amendment that makes subsistence a priority in our Title 8. And there's some political capital that'll have to be used for that, but subsistence is such an important issue in our state. There's certain things that working with the legislature are going to be easier than other things. Subsistence is one of those topics that Alaskans care enough about that there's enough political clout behind it. It's like the PFD. If you have a way to solve the PFD, the permanent fund dividend, then they're going to come along with it. We're solving subsistence issues. They're going to come along with it. Why? Because the people demand it. And if they don't, it's going to hinder them in the re-election process. Pushing back on industry pressure comes down to who you appoint and where you appoint them. Like we were talking about earlier, having commissioners of fish and game bifurcating. So we have one of fish, one of game, so that they can actually focus on their work. And then also treating subsistence like a priority and paramount use will defend it. Bringing tribes and federal subsistence boards. Also, the rules are written with rural people, not around them. So some people don't realize, especially urban Alaskans, a lot of them do not realize that ANILCA, again, Title 8, which can be confusing sometimes because we have the state constitution Title 8 and ANILCA Title 8. But ANILCA Title 8 has rural preference, which means all Alaskans who are in rural areas then get preference for subsistence, and it's a main way of living for Alaskans. So we want to keep that preference intact, and we want to make sure that the federal laws and the state laws start to coordinate with each other and work together, so that we don't have that incongruence, or if you walk over one boundary, all of a sudden you have a completely different rule book. I think that there's probably some give and take with the state and feds, but that is what I have to say about Title 8 and subsistence. Chris, do you want to add into that?
Meta, I don't think mentioned yet that her father was a subsistence fisherman. My mother grew up in uniquely living a subsistence lifestyle as well. So for us, these things are some of the most important issues for us, right? Defending and safeguarding this subsistence ways of life for the future are exactly the reasons, first and foremost, that Mita and I are running, and to make sure that's what I mean by Alaska being a viable place for our children to live in perpetuity. That's what it's all about. Yeah, so that's why we're doing things like splitting up fishing games, so we know that we have people being able to give their full attention to each, and whatever that means for different parts of Alaska.
Thank you, Chris. And then there's more wildlife questions too. So it has animal numbers are down in your region and in other regions as well. Fishing game does not listen. Can that be reformed? The answer is yes. We talked about it a little bit already. So that was the fish part of it that we really have a focus in on. But then there's also the game part of it, which I've heard actually directly from hunters, elders like Robert Thompson, and, elders in Arctic Village, and a lot of folks that the, Dall sheep populations are down. And in areas, moose populations are down. Also, caribou is down amongst most of the herds. And, we have an issue with Ambler Road being put in because it would disrupt the Western Arctic caribou herd, which I don't know if you guys know, but I worked for the Wilderness Society for 6 years, and one of my coworkers is Tim Fullman, and he is an ungulate scientist, and he actually helps to co-host and facilitate the Western Arctic caribou herd. And so he actually was helpful in getting out some of the science that did debunked Ada, because Ada did vibe science on the caribou over that would be affected by Ambler Road. And so I worked with the scientists who helped to put out the information to debunk that, and how the road would actually affect the caribou. So we want to fix this. The state has authority to correct, and it hasn't chosen to correct it. It basically has just focused on making sure that, sports hunters can come in and have access to hunting and fishing without necessarily addressing the issues that communities are experiencing. So customary and traditional use findings, community subsistence use designations, tier 1 and 2 hunts, where the harvestable surplus is limited, and reasonable limits on non-residents and guided hunts in subsistence areas. So that's part of how we need to correct it. And the governor with the commissioners actually has the ability to regulate how much subsistence versus sport hunting is happening. We want to make sure that locals are not crowded out of their own country. We'll also build management around local indigenous knowledge, not just flyover surveys, but actually having observations from communities. And I think that's a good segue to another one of your questions is a guardian program. The question was that there isn't a tribal government, so how many jobs per community? How would it even work? And I think that's a great question. Because the way it's written is to not be exclusion. It does put a lot of power in the tribes and local communities, but it's not exclusive only to tribal members. So we built it based on Alaska's on the Land Guardian networks that you can find in Southeast and Bristol Bay and also on St. Paul. But then there's Guardian programs that are actually in Canada that are working really well and in Australia. And so that's the foundation. It's built in that science and best practices. And part of this is actually to get money out into rural communities to diversify economy and make sure that money is spent in the communities, as well as then providing the best science and data so we can actually make better management decisions. And that's a really important part of it. Another part of it is not just passive observation, but actually active observation, active stewardship. So once we have decisions that are made, especially with like local or regional leadership, then implementing traditional ecological knowledge and Western science to then address issues with the best measures possible. And I think we're in a really good place in the world right now where we have advancements in Western science that's actually starting and has been starting to acknowledge traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous science. And when we bring them together, it's the best of both worlds. So for your community, how I understood this question is that you do not have a local tribe in the community that you're in. And that's okay. There's a lot of very small communities who don't have a tribe that's like housed in a community. And even for communities that are small that do have tribes, what the answer actually is to have consortia because there's going to be a need for support and funding. There's going to be need and support of having advisory councils, a need for having employees, as well as tools and having money to support all of this. And there's large regional tracts. In Alaska, we have 6 different ecoregions, and they all have different, things that are special about them. And we don't want to have, overlap from one region to another for management. But we do want to have a coalition building and even going beyond that into creating consortia. So your area would probably join a larger consortia and would want to advance hiring for the communities so that they can manage the lands around them. So there would be a consortia that would be built of tribes and communities, and then community members would be hired through that consortia, regardless of whether or not they're a tribal member or non-tribal member. So Wiseman would qualify, but not as it's just by itself. You would come into a group with more support, more technological support, and funds that get to be pulled together. This is another thing that we've actually been looking at. One of the things that has been brought to my attention was the issue with local fire departments. There's a lot of small local fire departments. And in our first few community visits, it was brought to my attention that like they do not have enough people or service enough homes or population to actually qualify for grants to get the types of equipment that they need. And so that would be another answer is to like create these consortia in regions so that they could then band together to create group grants and group funding mechanisms to then address the needs for the individual communities and the region together. Chris?
Like Meda was saying, that's something we've been seeing across the state when it regards with regard to getting state and federal funding out there. And the Guardian Network does return funds at about a 2.5 to 1 ratio. So every dollar spent on these Guardian funds returns $2.5 in value where they've been utilized. So that is a program that might take a little while to ramp up, but once people see its effectiveness, I think that'll be well implemented.
So the next question actually further down is how would you manage state resources to help salmon in their habitat? So, for instance, these guardian programs, when we're doing this work, there is a few things that have to be addressed. One of the things that we've been digging into understanding the trawling industry, which, on just topically, the idea of ending trawling sounds amazing. But when you dig in, then you find out there's actually multiple kinds of trawling and different levels and different fisheries and different fish that they're fishing, and different practices. And so I've been asking lots of questions from different groups, and we were just out in Alaska to understand. And so when we're looking at fishing industries, we have to actually understand the whole life cycle and all of the places that are involved with the fish, from eggs to fry to, their first years in the river, then out to going out to the ocean and their migration through the ocean and coming back to spawn. And what we're looking at is, again, like I said, Brad Harris. I've worked with him before, and um, digging into the trawling industry. The pollock trawling in the Bering Strait doesn't actually come into contact with as much Western chum as you would expect. And so they've been doing DNA to actually help to understand which chum they're getting. And so they have limits of chum, period. But then what they're finding is actually they're getting a lot of chum from Russia. So Russia has been doing this thing where they just flood the area with hatchery salmon, which is an issue because hatchery salmon are more prone to disease. There's less biological diversification, DNA diversification. And then they're also getting salmon up from the southern seas. China's doing the same thing. So they're just trying to like play the numbers game to get as much salmon out there to get some kind of return. But what we're finding out is there's habitat loss in the ocean. There's also warming in the rivers and the ocean. There's food source issues, and really a complex host of things that are addressing our fisheries. So part of the trawling areas, what I was alerted to by locals was that the Area M fishery is actually the one that has the most Western Alaskan salmon bycatch that needs to be addressed. And then there's Amendment 80 boats, and those are the boats that are still dragging the bottom. Those are mostly through the Gulf of Alaska, where they're doing those activities. So that's a low-hanging fruit that obviously has to be addressed right away. Once we get from there, then we need to understand, what's going on with the warming of the rivers, and what can be done about that. So we have a few issues. One, we're losing permafrost very rapidly. Two, we actually have a lot of wildfires that affects our natural ecosystem, the shades of the river. And so if we loop it back, if we have people who are on the land and they are actively doing traditional ecological burning in the winter, it's going to reduce the wildfires in the summer and help to some of that regulation. And actually, the state of Alaska spends over $73 million a year on wildfires. So when we start to reduce the wildfires and the cost in the summer, that actually helps to pay for the program. The next aspect of that is also bringing in another traditional ecological knowledge. It's called the Fog Women story. And down in Southeast, we have a practice of seeding our rivers in a way that helps to diversify the DNA and support the fish that are going out with the nutrients. I know, Chris, you like to talk about this one, so I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, so that's a big one. There are a lot of ways to look at this salmon problem that are not just ban all trawl. One of the things we discovered when we were down on Alaska was how much care they put into not catching bycatch, and when they do, a lot of effort into where that salmon was coming from and how to avoid those areas. They have Starlink for near real-time identification, like, oops, I caught a salmon over here, like avoid this area, and that goes out to the whole fleet. And that's pretty well implemented by the CDQs. So that's one of the reasons we're hesitant to just go in and take that line and really figure out what we're doing so we don't jump out of the fire and into the or out of the frying pan and into the fire. When we have other things we can be doing, and seeding the salmon's a big one. You probably know that salmon return to the rivers where they come from. So like hatcheries might be fine if your goal is to support the industry and just having a lot of salmon out there. But if you're trying to support the subsistence fishermen and also the wildlife, the bears and other predators that are dependent on this, local communities can seed the salmon locally very easily. It does not take very expensive equipment to do it. It takes a little bit of equipment, but then we're putting a lot more salmon into the waters to begin with, which increases the yield for everyone. It has much better results in getting those salmons back to the rivers where the people, where the subsistence communities need them. And then we're also looking at things like restoring habitat, whether it's, creating artificial coral or sinking ships in certain areas so that the salmon can flourish in a much greater way. Those are all things. So we really are trying to do this intelligently as possible, without, pulling one string in and pulling the rug out from somewhere else.
Yeah, great. And that's a good segue. We're making good time here through the questions. So I'm just actually going to go through into the question about Irma somebody submitted. So on my website, I have the implementation of IRMA mining standards. So IRMA is the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. It's an independent voluntary standards started in 2014 that sets third-party auditors to mine sites to measure real performance on the environment, water, air, worker safety, human rights, and community and indigenous consent. There's a board for IRMA that holds 2 votes from each of the 6 sectors. So mining companies, buyers, investors, affected communities, and indigenous rights holders, and labor and environmental and human rights groups. All these communities hold equal voting power, so the industry cannot capture it all. And that's one of the issues that we have here in the state is a lot of our mining and oil and gas standards are actually produced by the mining and oil and gas industry, and then they're just handed over carte blanche to the state. The state approves them, and then everybody, pats each other on the backs, and rich people get richer. And we have environmental degradation that happens in association. So pulling back and saying that we actually need to have the communities who are affected, not only just the communities, but also the indigenous and tribal entities who are affected have a say at the table. And so this model that they have implemented results when they do go and review a mine, then it's certified for 3 years. And then it needs to be recertified after that period of time. But when they're looking through the requirements, there's over 400 plus audible requirements for a mining or oil and gas extraction industry. And there's 4 achievement levels. So the mines can earn a public level of transparency that's rated at 50, 75, or 100. And the audit results are public, so the community can hold the operation to what it is promised. It is a model of standards for independent, transparent, and science-based approach. And this is what I actually want to bring into Alaska because we have all of this natural abundance and we have the ability to mine, we have the ability to work with some of the fossil fuels, but not at the cost of our natural areas, not at the cost of our environment, not at the cost of our fish, our caribou. We do not have to compromise. And there are, what does that mean? Well, it means that there's going to be less profit for billionaires, but it's still going to be profitable. We are given false choices all the time between 2 different paradigms. It's like when they're, pitting us against the idea of having, no natural gas on the rail system in South Central. They're like, oh, you're going to run out of gas in 6 years. Well, of course, you have to have this LNG pipeline that's worth actually more than $60 billion. And because, it's in your best interest, we're going to give away all the tax and royalty revenues. We don't have to do that. It's actually it's manipulation. So we have access to oil and gas. We also actually need to transition and decouple from oil and gas and start to have our renewable energy, sustainable energy brought into play. So for different communities like where you're at, you're going to get 24 hours of sunlight in the summer. If we match that with wind power or hydropower or biodigesters, that can all reduce the need for the use of fossil fuels, which for in some communities like Yakpat Kwan, where I'm the president, they're going to be looking at $17 a gallon for heating fuel this winter. That's not livable. We've been working on looking at, again, hydropower, tidal power, solar power for that community, which will be implemented in the next few years. So when we're looking at the state, each region is going to have its own needs for energy diversification to provide energy. And then there's also the need to diversify economy. And some communities have the ability and want to have a small scale mining that will happen. Those will all have to be put through these stringent standards of we will not compromise our fish, we will not compromise our caribou, we will not compromise our communities or watersheds. But how do we move forward? And so the LNG pipeline does not pan out on, the budget doesn't work. We can't give away the oil and tax revenue that we see already, and they're wanting to give it away with the LNG pipeline. Right now with the oil and gas giveaways, with the royalties and the taxes, it's close to $900 million. If we have LNG pipeline that comes down and they give those taxes away, that's going to be approximately $700 million. Between both of them is $1.6 billion to give away. And that's actually against our constitution, because if we're doing any of that work, it should be for the maximum benefit of the people. In tandem, this question also has about Ambler Road. I am not pro Ambler Road. Ambler Road has opposition by 88 different communities and tribal members. And what they did was they took out six and they touted around and been like, look, we have support. Six corporations is not the same as tribal sovereignty and communities who oppose. So that doesn't pass the standards. Also, with the road that they're wanting to put in, it's going to disrupt the Western Arctic caribou herd. And there's just issue after issue after issue that hasn't been addressed, and that in my framework couldn't move forward until, well, this one shouldn't move forward, but other big projects shouldn't move forward until all the issues are addressed with the community and there's a consensus that the best methods are being used. Chris, I'll volley to you.
Yeah, man, there was a lot there. So, one of the things that came to mind was when I was working in the engineering department of ANTHC, some of the senior engineers noted like there's a lot of good ways to do mining, but they're slow and they're not as attractive to those international outside mega corporations that want to get the biggest return on their investment in the smallest amount of time as they can. But if you are managing, as our Constitution requires, to the maximum benefit of the people, that slow mining or that slower stage mining is not only safer, but then it makes the mine last a lot longer, which makes those well-paying jobs last a lot longer. And so we're not just burning through it.
It does ask in here, what large project do I support? I actually do support the West Susitna Guantanamo Dam. A long time ago, I didn't, because I was under the impression that it affected salmon spawning habitat. But I've been working with Deborah Call and other tribal leaders, and what they brought to my attention is that it actually does not. So the dam would be up in Devil's Canyon and would be up in an area that's above salmon spawning habitat. Um, and it's not against the wide part of the river. It's not this massive like Hoover Dam like I was believing that it would be. So that's been interesting. One of the things that is most concerning would be there would actually be a road put in, and that's a kind of a separate issue. And Alexander Creek is worried about having it being open to the public and having their traditional subsistence areas being flooded. And so something like that, a workaround would be actually just asking Alexander Creek to have that be a road that they maintain. They hold the contracts for building, they maintain, and they have ownership of it. And then it's a private road, which they could then block access and then lease to the, corporation who would be, or the partners, I should say, who would be running the dam. Um, and so that is something that I would suggest that we move forward on to help replace this dependence on liquid natural gas on the rail belt and here in Anchorage. One of the things that we have an issue with is ADA, like I said earlier. Everyone hates ADA, and ADA has been used kind of as the governor's personal corporate play toy, and it shouldn't actually be that way. ADA is actually supposed to be under the legislative purview, and a lot of the board members in ADA have been put in as friends of the governor. I think that there should be a much more rigorous test of who gets put in those positions, like an interview, an actual job interview of people who understand industry, who understand Alaskan issues, who are going to be fair-minded. One of the things that I will do as governor is end Ada's leases in the Arctic Refuge. We had 3 lease sales that happened for the coastal plain of the porcupine caribou herd in their calving grounds. And all 3 times they were failures. And even Trump, this last time, he went to, thought it was going to be huge. And again, it was a flop. The only people who bid were Ada and Hex, which is an industry out of Anchorage. That's a sacred place for the Gwich'in and for the largest living caribou herd in the world. Um, and that should be a protected space, a sacred space, and it doesn't make sense. I could go to Chesapeake Lake next, but I want to hold for Chris.
We were talking about alternative energy sources, and as much as we do support the careful and responsible development of our oil, gas, and mining, one of the things some people have pushed out back on the renewable energy on is that, oh, it's been tried before, and it wasn't effective. And there's a few things to say about that. One, the technology has developed a lot since then, to being far more economical, far more effective, and easier to implement. And one of the really cool things that I like to bring up to people, especially in the Arctic regions, is Finland had an amazing development that's kind of brilliant because it's not particularly advanced. It's very cost effective. They use sand batteries. So, and by sand batteries, I mean like literally silos full of sand that they use as insulators to store heat in the summer months, with their solar arrays and whatnot. And they're very effective. And then that heat at near 100% efficiency can just be vented into homes and, support heating in the winter for extremely low cost. And because I mean, it's sand, right? It's literally dirt cheap. But, we can set that we can set it up anywhere. Transportation cost is hardly anything. You just have to build them. So there are a lot of ways where we can build out and diversify our energy infrastructure and our economic infrastructure by extension, where we're not so dependent on these booms and busts of oil and gas and the politics of tariffs and international wars and all that kind of stuff.
Is that our new campaign slogan? Sand batteries like dirt, dirt cheap.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Sorry, we love dad jokes. Um, Thank you. So the new trilateral agreement on Chesapeake Lake was a was wonderful. You know, it's something that was agreed upon by the borough, by the tribe, by the corporation. Nuiqsut is surrounded by oil and gas companies. Um, you know, anybody who is entering into Nuiqsut and taking the Hall Road, they actually have to have their driver's license and papers to be able to go to their community. It is definitely a different experience of living, and they don't have their freedoms like we are actually used to, because they're surrounded by that industry. There's also massive health issues. Rosemary has been working as a community health aide and as an advocate. She was even the mayor. They've been documenting the excuse me, the health issues associated with industry for decades now. They even had a blowout where the community wasn't even informed, but the oil rigs were evacuated. And so there's a lot of inequality that's actually happening up by Nuiqsut. And so the trilateral agreement was beautiful because it had groups that historically had issues working together, came together for a purpose, for their people, for the subsistence areas, and to make sure that they could have this part of their world be maintained as pristine. And you know, because they love their way of life. They love their families. They love their community. They love the land around them. And so wanted to retain that piece. And it wasn't even all the way around Teshepuk Lake. It was just very specifically in those special areas. And it was approved, it went through, and then of course it was rescinded by this current administration, which is incredibly sad. It's being tried in court. I think Earth Justice and Alaska trustees are trying it in court currently. The state of Alaska does not have a lot of say in the special areas of Chesapeake Lake because it is it's a federal area, a National Petroleum Reserve Act in Alaska. But the state can and join the lawsuits with the community, with the tribe, with the corporation, and also advocate with our state representatives, you know, the senators and the Congress people to actually represent Alaskans accordingly. So that would be something that, you know, we would do as a state is we have a direct line to other governors, we have a direct line to the senators, we have a direct line to the congressmen. We even have a direct line to the president. And so we would be saying, hey, this is, you know, what the state believes. This is the law behind it. This is the research and policies behind it. And we stand with our people. There's a good question about education and public services. So as I said earlier, currently the taxes roughly that are being given away on the oil and gas development that's happening in the state between the S Corp loophole and the corporate welfare that's going to the North Slope is roughly $800 to $900 million. If you close that loop, then no, all of a sudden, guess what? We do not have to choose between providing services to the people and a permanent fund. Um, so that's going to be right off the bat. The next part is diversifying economy. We talked about guardians. That's one way of bringing jobs out to the communities. That's environmentally based and good stewardship based. We also need to look at the diversification of our economies through bringing in food production. One of the issues that we have is we still ship in 95% of our food and goods, and the manufacturing that is out of state. And so if we bring in manufacturing, if we bring in food production, then we're actually going to do two things. One, with the renewable energy we talked about, we're going to lower the cost of living, also lowering the cost of food production. So if we're producing food here, then it's going to be more affordable. It's also going to keep the dollars in the state. You're going to have higher nutrition in your food and more say of what's happening in the lands around you. So I'm going to also hand over in Bale to Chris again.
Yeah, so it's not just taxing the oil and gas companies. It's also putting more pressure on them to hire Alaska workers so that money stays in Alaska and recirculates in the economy. But I mean, there's a lot of things that go into the food security. We have a lot of unused space in a lot of our schoolhouses where we can do hydroponic gardening, where we're teaching the kids how to grow indoors, and then they can take that food home and eat it. So we're helping the food security there. We want free breakfast and lunch for every public school student. We know a lot of kids in Alaska are hungry across rural Alaska and even in the big cities, right? And so we're making sure our kids are fed and ready to learn. We're pulling that financial burden off of struggling families, which, also correlates with reducing domestic violence rates and all that. So there's all these interconnected benefits where when you start taking care of the people, it actually saves you money in the a long run. It's one of the themes of the campaign. Um, Prevention's always more affordable than prices, right? So that applies to feeding people, that applies to our healthcare, that applies to relocating certain villages that are facing these disastrous fall storms. Um, and yeah, I mean, there's just so many different ways we can look at that. Yeah, building the agriculture using indigenous plants, that makes it a lot easier. And again, using the energy when we build out that energy infrastructure, that's going to make it really cheap to supply the heat to our greenhouses and our indoor groweries. So yeah.
Thank you. And one of the questions that was specifically on the industry of Coldfoot was, and Wiseman was around tourism. It looks like, the community and its whole economy or the majority of its economy is based on tourism. Throughout the state, the Alaska Travel Industry Association and small operators, the businesses in Coldfoot and Wiseman are not separate from most of our rural communities. A lot of our rural communities are based heavily. Tourism is a $4 billion a year industry that has 48,000 jobs. That is, for a state that only has 734,000 residents, that is over 5% of our residents depend on that industry. So over $200 million to the state and local governments in taxes and fees and bed taxes, et cetera, permits. It's one of our cornerstone industries that we have right now. The challenge that we have to balance is making sure that we do not have outside operators who are monopolizing the community areas, like in Southeast. We have where the tour ships owns most of the communities, the shops, they own the hotels, the restaurants, the shops, the cruise ships, and everything. Addressing that in diversification and laws that support mom and pops or local industry is very important. There's also the load or the weight of pollution associated with the tourism industry that could be addressed through laws and policies as well. But we're coming up onto an hour, and I know that we're scheduled for longer than an hour, but I feel like that may be too long for people. There's folks already leaving. So what I would like to do is transition now specifically to any questions that people may have.
I've lived in Wiseman before the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and this whole gas line situation has been in play for over 50 years. They've been talking about building a gas line for years. The reality is the 42-inch gas line is just overkill. Most pipelines are built at 36 inches. That would be more cost effective for any landfare the state of Alaska to build. That would be much more cost effective to produce gas for the people of Alaska. The idea that we're going to make all this money, blow all this gas pressure off the North Slope, 50 trillion cubic feet. I feel that that your administration should think more in the future. I'm not sure where they're going to go with this gas line thing, but the cost of a 42-inch line is a huge consideration. We talked about 42-inch gas lines about 20 years ago with the real Alaska LNG. That was BP, Exxon, and Phillips. They're going to go down the highway, but then fracking in the United States drove that project off the table. But this giving away this gas, that's a priority for the state of Alaska. It's constitutional for maximum benefit of the people of Alaska. And this building this giant gas line would put the state in a real, we could be in a real liability situation with that kind of money on the table. It's 60 billion. It could be $100 billion. It costs a lot of money for the equipment to actually build a line like that. And the compressor stations, the maintenance costs on that would be exorbitant. So I would think that you should really look into other, you can Google that. Most pipelines are 36, and that would be a lot cheaper. It'd be more benefit to the state of Alaska. And again, you know, straight, you're talking about these extending these jobs over a longer period of time for the mining industry. This would extend this use of gas for Alaskans over a longer period of time. That was what I wanted to talk about. Another issue that I want to talk about is hatchery production. The hatchery production in the southern part of Alaska is destroying our salmon runs for the Western AYK, Alaska Western stocks. I sit on the Kaikoke River Advisory Committee and of the Western Interior Regional Advisory Council of the Federal Subsistence Board. State of Alaska release all around 1.1, 1.2 million pink salmon annually, when in reality, pink salmon have a high year and a low year, a high year and a low year. That gives the Chinook salmon a chance in their lifespan to actually have enough food to return back home. So Washington State releases 200 million pinks on the high year and 0 on the low year. I feel that you're talking about, how to get our salmon back. The elephant in the room is the hatchery program in Alaska. It's destroying not just Alaska's stocks, California, Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, as well as because all the salmon, all the Chinook salmon go to the North Pacific, Gulf of Alaska, where the deep upwelling waters are coming onto the continental shelf. And our Chinook salmon, the last 2 years on the Yukon River, we've had 24,500 into Canada with a 71 million escapement goal. We have to get this thing under control because we're looking at another bad year right now. We're only like 60 million. We're not going to even make that goal again. So I think that I like your idea of dividing the board of game from the board of fish. The commissioners also to focus on their jobs. The boards of game has been basically controlled by the guiding industry, the commercial entities, and so is the board of fish. The board of fish is comprised of the Aquaculture Association, the Seiners Association. You got a 7-member board. You can't go anywhere with any kind of real science. I would like to see real science involved in your administration's future endeavors to manage our fish and wildlife for the best interest of the people of Alaska. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I agree with everything you just said.
Yeah.
So the thing about, LNG is they have these proposals. They haven't even been forthright with all of the proposals for this pipeline with Alaskans. What they're finding out in the legislature is right now, the deal that's in place is we put forth so much money, I think 75% of the cost, and then that we're not even prioritizing Alaskans first in the deal that they're making. They're actually prioritizing exportation above Alaskan access first, which should infuriate just about anybody. Along with that, so this gas, I mean, they're already flaring it. It's coming out of the North Slope oil fields. They've been burning it at night. For a long time, they said they weren't burning it, but then there was satellite imagery of at night burns throughout the fall, winter, and spring. So it's proven that they have been flaring and burning it off. But there's a lot of things that we could do. Instead of oil and gas shipping down a pipeline, why don't we refine it up there into energy and then have the energy line coming down through that corridor? So best science needs to come in and make real recommendations that are for the people first. Thank you.
Yeah, on the LNG, we've had some people approach us and talk about, quote, well, what about just the first stage? And you mentioned a smaller diameter pipeline where, it's possible that it would be feasible. And that's, one of the things about us being nonpartisan is we we're not necessarily for or against any particular program. We want to see how it's going to work. In the feasibility studies, is this going to be an economic engine for Alaskans, or is it going to be a disaster? And the last thing we want to have is to pour billions of dollars of our state resources into a program that builds a pipeline that ships our resources out of the state and out of the country, and the profits go right to the corporations with their tax breaks, and we're just high and dry, worse for wear. So yes, science, data-driven policies, best practices, that's our approach to every policy that we have, and that's the bottom line. Like, does it work and does it make sense?
Opening up for other questions or statements, and just like we heard, if there's information that you think that we need to know, we're open for that too. This is a two-way conversation. We're here to learn from you just as much as we're here to share with you.
Hi, my name's Molly. My husband Sean and I own a lodge, and so we're in tourism in Wiseman. And you mentioned ATIA and just how big the tourism industry is. The budget for the tourism industry has gone from something like $15 million down to $3 million. And the current governor wanted to do away with all of the millions for the tourism industry, for ATIA and all of that. I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on the needs of the tourism industry, specifically through ATIA, because you're right. I mean, at least Sean and I work with ATIA and Explore Fairbanks to promote, what we're doing. So just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, because I know from our side, hearing from ATIA, it seems like they struggle to get the budget that they want every single year, since, we've been involved with them. So
I actually feel strongly about that because the industry, as we said earlier, brings in so much money to the state that those dollars for the budget, it's not a loss. It actually is an investment that will then bring in more money to the state that also circulates within the state. And so having local ownership, also investing in cultural tourism and ecotourism, and we live in one of the most beautiful places on earth. We have some of the most intact, healthy environments on the earth. And that's because of our Constitution and because of the people who are fighting to care for it. And if we're going to diversify our economy and decouple from oil and gas and decouple from the economic structure of being an extraction colony, then we have to go for our low-hanging fruit first, and that would be our tourism industry and supporting our local economies and providers. So making sure that we have an adequate budget for the Alaska Tourism Board is a high priority of ours. And like I said, any dollars that we put in there is not a waste of money, it's an investment of money.
thank you.
Yeah, and Mita said a lot of things I was going to say, but I mean that there's a lot of things that just our platform supports the tourism passively already, right? Like what are people coming to Alaska for? It is that natural beauty, right? So we do take care of those things, and another aspect is the ferry system. The Alaska Marine Highway, putting funding back into that so people can get around and they can enjoy the tourism around the state a lot more affordably, and we can support that infrastructure everywhere across the state, and the local energy bringing costs down. Like, yeah, it's all integrated. And yes, we do intend to support the tourism both directly and it will receive these indirect measures from our other platforms.
Thank you, Molly. Any other questions or statements?
Let's hope it all works out at the polls.
Yes. That's a big deal. I've been telling people a lot that we are nonpartisans. We were calling ourselves independents, but they got rid of that. That's not a category anymore. So we're nonpartisans. But the Democrats and Republicans would both very much like to squeeze us out, pretend we're not real, not invite us to the forums, all that kind of stuff. And so we are very dependent on people like yourselves, asking these tough questions, getting, the best answers we can give. We try very hard not to be evasive and give the typical political mealy-mouthed answers or change the question to the things we want to answer. So, if you support that, it's really important that you get out and you tell people, you tell people who we are, what we're about, why you support us, and try to get them to tell their friends as well. And that's our path to victory. So I very much appreciate you giving us the time to talk and answer your questions, and it's been nice to hear from you all as well.
That's the thing about grassroots organizing. I've been a grassroots organizer and worked with communities for over 25 years. We had massive success with the recall. The only reason it didn't complete and go to a vote was because we had the pandemic, and the community asked us, to stop because they didn't want to upset the power structure, and people were afraid of imminent collapse of everything. So we did pull back and listen to the people, but I've seen the grassroots organizing power of the state. And here word of mouth, I jokingly call it the cousin campaign because I was at one event and there's this lady from Southwest Alaska, and she's like, "Well, what do we do?" And I'm like, "Well, I just need you to go tell all your cousins and tell them to tell all their cousins." And she looked at me and she's like, "All of my cousins?" She's like, "Oh yeah, you'll win." So it's peer-to-peer organizing, message your friends and family, your coworkers, your network. And, if anything, just ask them to look at the policies. We're the most transparent team out there. We did the work to do actual research, and we have white pages on 10 policies on the website, but we're open to answering questions on any other kind of policies or priorities for rural Alaska. And here's the crazy numbers. You want to hear the crazy numbers? This primary, because there's 17 candidates or tickets running, they believe that the top vote getter is going to be about 35,000 people. And so in ranked choice voting, we have open primaries, one person, one vote. And they believe that of those four that are going to move from the primary into the general, they believe the bottom of the four are going to be decided by 40 to 50 vote spreads, anywhere from 12 to 15,000 votes. And so we're actually very excited because 12 to 15,000 votes is doable. And if you look at 35,000 votes, that's doable. And the thing is getting out in front of people, sharing the messages, and being available. And so that's why I said thank you for being our test community for doing these webinars, because it's like, how do we amplify and get out to more people? Because we don't have enough time in 2 years to knock every door or call every person. So this is part of the team's brilliant. AJ, thank you for being brilliant. And also, Stephen, thank you for coming on along with us and being a super volunteer. We really appreciate all of you in this process. And we're here for any more questions. But also, it's a beautiful evening in Alaska. So I think that we should probably come to a close, but I want to hear from AJ.
Steve informed me of some craziness, how you guys aren't allowed to chop wood. What's going on with that? Is that real?
So, but yeah, there was a brief moment where it's pretty much just illegal to do anything here. I feel like yeah, we couldn't even chop wood. Since this was BLM land, so it was kind of managed for federal subsistence. But then when it was handed to the state because they selected it, yeah, the DNR essentially said that we couldn't even like chop wood or anything like that because there's no what is it? There's no wood cutting areas north of the Yukon River, essentially.
They have no understanding of what it's like to live in Alaska or how it's survive.
Well, and then the irony of the whole situation is that the DNR came and had a meeting with the community in which we all discovered that we couldn't cut wood. And then there was a guy in the room that literally said, I think he thought we'd be excited, but he said he'd been working his entire career on getting the LO 5150 overturned. And so you would think along that whole career, someone might have occurred to someone that there are people living in this corridor that need to go and need access to certain places to do certain things. But apparently no one thought of it. So,
And that just shows that there wasn't community listening sessions, there wasn't collaboration, there wasn't adequate representation. And I'm sorry that happened.
And one more question, Sean, Molly, what kind of tourism do you guys have going on out there over at Coldfoot and Wiseman?
well, basically everybody in the village works in tourism in one way or the other, which is pretty cool. There's two longstanding lodges downtown Wiseman that have been around for a very long time, Boreal Lodge and Arctic Getaway. I see Bernie. I don't know if Uta's behind Steve.
No, she's
There he is.
Okay, okay. And then Scott and Heidi own Boreal Lodge, and so they do, more like when people want to come to town and stay. Sean and I do retreat lodging, so we only host a certain amount of retreats every year, and that's when people come. And then Jack is basically running tours like all day, every day in the summer and winter. And yeah, we all kind of contribute to that local tourist economy.
Steve runs dog mushing, or he runs dog mushing tours. So come along and hop in the dog sled.
He's one of, if not the greatest dog musher in the Brooks Range.
Nice.
Awesome.
Bernie's right behind me.
I know.
Wow, you're so cool.
Yeah. I was gonna say too, like the whole PLO 5150, the CRA that was overturned at the end of last year, all of the issues concerning that are super complex. And that's one thing not a lot of people firewood was like it's like the tip of the iceberg for how life has changed for everybody in the village with the lands shifting to the state. And it's a really complex thing. So I feel like that's a topic for another time. But yeah, there's a lot that's changed in Wiseman just in months.
I just want to say thank you again to Steve and AJ for setting this up. I think it went really well. I think that this fits the tone of the campaign and wanting to connect with real Alaskans, real people.